So I'm really excited to be here, and I want to start I was going to introduce Paige and Marianne, but it's already happened once and we'll do it again at the end. But I want to start by thanking Drs. Dixon and Longjohn and Marianne, actually, who first kind of came up with this idea and got it started. And then the Monica and Nikki and Casey, who have really worked hard to make it come to fruition here. So thanks to each of them. Thanks to Emily for being here. But most of all, thanks to you guys for your interest and your enthusiasm. I am so thrilled that there are 27 people here online, and I'm not sure how many there are out there in enjoying dinner with you, but that's really wonderful. So what are we going to do today? Well, this is what we're going to do today. We're going to do a quick overview about why medical students should learn about climate change and what our role is as health professionals, what you can do as a student, and I'll look at kind of state level opportunities through MiCCA and maybe some federal level opportunities through Citizens Climate Lobby. Paige will tell you a little bit about her experiences at University of Michigan. She's been a great leader in terms of climate there. And then Marianne will discuss some local opportunities that you could potentially take advantage of through Citizens Climate Lobby. And then we'll open it up for what I hope is just a questions and discussion and brainstorming idea about what you guys would like to do as next steps. So I am going to do some case histories in this process, and I want to, in full disclosure, tell you that I talked to Dr. Caitlin Rubley, who's at the Medical College of Wisconsin. She's in the emergency department, and she presented these case histories at the annual meeting for the consortium, and she told us that we could use them here. So they're going to be told from an emergency room doctor's perspective. So let's start with, how does climate change affect human health? This chart is from the CDC, and basically the take-home message with this is that climate change impacts almost every aspect of human health, whether you're talking about air pollution, water quality, vector-borne diseases, allergens, heat, and mental health issues. It impacts them all. And one of the ways to think about it is that it acts as a threat multiplier. It takes what in many situations is a manageable medical condition, which we have learned how to treat, and on some occasions tips it into a medical emergency. It multiplies the impact of the original process. So connecting those dots is key to really treating your patient adequately. So let's start with air pollution. When I think about the health impacts of burning fossil fuels, I like to divide it into two categories. Some of the byproducts of burning fossil fuels causes immediate health impacts, direct health impacts in the form of air pollution, things like ozone and fine particulate matter, which interestingly enough, fall out of the atmosphere very, very quickly. And that's important because if we transition away from fossil fuels as our primary energy source, many of the health impacts that are related to these air pollutants will improve very quickly. Then there are the long-term consequences from things like CO2 and methane, which are heat-trapping gases. And unfortunately, they stay in the atmosphere much longer. And that's why it's so critical that we don't waste any time in addressing climate change. I want to take a minute to look at these direct impacts a little bit closer with ozone and fine particulate matter. And what happens in this situation is things like nitrous oxide and sulfur oxides come out off of things like power plants and heavy traffic in the cities. And they combine with some natural components like volatile organic compounds, sun and heat to produce ozone and fine particulate matter. And those are air pollutants that we're talking about. And they're really a form of secondhand smoke. And unfortunately, it disproportionately impacts the people who live in these heavy industrialized areas, the frontline communities, if you will. So what I'd like to do is take you through our first case history. So this is a 23-year-old female who has a history of asthma, who had really been doing quite well on her current regimen of inhalers. She had a good oxygen status. She did develop COVID recently, but she seemed to be recovering from that until there was a nearby wildfire with significant smoke exposure. By that time, she was just overwhelmed and came into your emergency department. She was in extremis. She was unable to talk. You began emergency respiratory interventions, but unfortunately you had to intubate her and put her on a ventilator, and you even had to contact the ECMO team because of your concern about worsening failure. So in this situation, climate change acted like a threat multiplier. And it is important to realize there are a couple studies, really it's the same study, one summary and one in-depth study from Harvard that found that just a small increase in fine particulate matter significantly increases mortality of COVID. So a threat multiplier. I hope that's a good example for you. So why is this pertinent in Michigan? We don't have wildfires, right? But we do see the smoke of wildfires. This is captured on one day in July this year from the NOAA. And you can see how it really, the smoke from wildfires spread from Canada down all across the US, and that the western part of the state often gets really impacted, particularly a lot. In Michigan, the following counties, which I have listed here, all had failing grades in the latest state of the air report for ozone. And a lot of that is related to wildfires. The other thing to realize with ozone in particular is that as temperatures increase, ozone concentration increases. So air quality worsens as temperatures increase. We see more frequent hot temperatures with the change in climate. Worldwide, believe it or not, more people die of air pollution than TB, malaria, and AIDS combined. That's including indoor and outdoor air pollution. And again, that's a global number. It's a little bit less in the US. Fine particulate matter in 2018 was estimated to be contribute to premature deaths in 1 out of 5 deaths. According to Nature in 2020, it contributed to 5 to 10% of premature deaths in the contiguous US. And there's a correlation, not necessarily causation, between fine particulate exposure and cognitive difficulties in the elderly, increased incidence of preterm deliveries, low birth weight, and stillbirths in the US. So we usually always think about it in terms of asthma and lung cancer, but really the impacts of fine particulate matter goes much further than that. And then there's the link to COVID mortality that I just mentioned earlier. I want to emphasize, though, that when we're talking about air pollutants, as opposed to greenhouse gases, air pollutants fall out of the atmosphere rapidly. And so if we transition away from fossil fuels in order to address climate change, we will see many health co-benefits, which is one good reason to change and is a convincing argument to somebody who maybe isn't convinced that climate change is an issue. This is from Dr. Drew Shandell from Duke University, who says if we can keep the emissions down low enough that we can stay under 2 degrees C, we will actually avoid 4.5 million premature deaths in the US over 50 years. 3.5 million hospitalizations and ER visits, estimated to be about 1,100 asthma attacks in Michigan for those under 18, avoid about 300 million lost work days over 50 years. That's about 579,000 lost work days in Michigan annually, 1.7 million avoided cases of dementia, and about $700 billion per year in benefits from improved health and labor. So for people who are not talking necessarily, are more concerned to say about the finances than they are about the human health impact, this is a great argument. Now let's look a little bit at extreme heat. We certainly know that temperatures, the average global temperatures are increasing. And if we continue to burn fossil fuels as we are right now, Detroit is going to feel more like the panhandle of Texas. And that does not sound like fun by the end of the century. So I want to look at our next case. So this is an unusually hot day in the emergency room when a 65-year-old female who has chronic afibrillation and is on Coumadin is brought in by an ambulance with altered mental status. She's unable to get a good history from her. You're unable to get a good history from her. So you decide to get her into the CT scan. You look at the images, which are on the right, and you see, you might recognize that there's a skull fracture here and an associated epidural hematoma. You decide to reverse her Coumadin or anticoagulation, and you get a consult from neurosurgery. Her daughter arrives 5 minutes later and tells you that their air conditioning had gone out 4 days ago in their home, and that when the patient had been doing quite well, given the heat, she developed a syncopal episode, most likely because of dehydration. So in this situation, again, climate change is acting as a threat multiplier. She certainly had background illness, but then the heat tips her over, especially when she doesn't have air conditioning to help her. So heat kills. It particularly impacts people who are very old and very young. Every year we lose a few athletes due to extreme heat events, and especially people in inner cities are vulnerable. And that's because of the urban heat island effect. Now, I don't know how many of you are familiar with this, but historically, communities and cities were divided into A, B, C, and D. This is called redlining. The red areas being less desirable for areas, and the only areas where people of color were allowed to buy homes. And then the peripheral areas were the areas that they were excluded. So this was historic redlining dating back to the 1930s. If you go back and you look at the temperature, well, let's start down here on the bottom right. If you look at this map and you look at the areas that are redlined, you see these areas are much more, have much higher density of solid surfaces like concrete and asphalt, whereas the peripheral areas have many more green spaces. And if you look at the temperature gradient, these bright yellow areas are the areas that have the concrete and were traditionally redlined. So this is really an example that of historic redlining or systemic racism that persists and impacts health. And this pattern persists when we look at heat, but it also persists for air quality, long-term health, and life expectancy. And even the access to voting, there's a smaller proportion of people who can get in and vote in these areas, at least if you look at how many are voting. And it's one reason why many people are beginning to think voting rights is actually a health issue. And I think it's the core of systemic racism. Okay, let's change over to systemic changes in vector ecology. And we've got another case. This is a 26-year-old college student with altered mental status. She had seizure-like activity when she was brought in by the EMS, but she's not seizing now. You recognize, though, that she is encephalopathic, and you're very concerned about her. As far as you know, she was otherwise healthy. So you do a full workup, and you end up having to perform a LP or lumbar puncture. Her CSF demonstrates a lymphocytosis, but it does not reveal an etiology. Eventually, her serologies come back positive for West Nile virus. Seizures are uncommon with West Nile virus, but West Nile virus is the most common arboviral disease across the continental US, and the incidence of neuroinvasive disease is increasing substantially. There was a 25% increase in 2018. So it's something to think about when somebody comes in with seizures, encephalopathy, or flaccid paralysis. Again, here's just an example of the number of days in which mosquitoes had been present back in the 1980s to 1989 in Grand Rapids, and now are present this was 2006, so it's somewhat dated. I'm sure it's even more now as the temperatures have warmed. And the incidence of West Nile virus in 2002 was the first reported case. There were 1,164 in 2016. So something to consider. With vector-borne diseases, it's not necessarily specifically related to climate change, but as the climate warms in a multifactorial way, it does change the geographic spread, and as conditions get wetter. Everybody hanging in with me so far? I'm going to keep moving then. We have another patient now. Now there's a trauma alert overhead, and they bring in a 50-year-old male who suffered from a motor vehicle accident. When you see a single vehicle motor vehicle accident, you have to think, what medical etiology is behind this accident? So you follow advanced trauma support, life support, and you get him hooked up to the monitor, and what you see is that he's in complete heart block. His heart rate is around 30s to 40s and bouncing around. He's stable at present, but you're confused, but you're concerned. You do a full trauma evaluation. You notice that he has a partial amputation, traumatic amputation of his arm, and a small head bleed. Ultimately, he is diagnosed with, any guesses? Lyme myocarditis. So again, this is a vector-borne disease. And what we see again, as conditions get hotter and wetter, that these black-legged ticks that carry Lyme disease are spreading. They're spreading in Michigan, they're spreading throughout the US. In 1998, there were 5 counties in the US, in Michigan, that had ticks that contained Lyme disease. It's up to 22 counties in 2021. So their distribution is spreading as the temperature warms. Okay, what about severe weather? And we're kind of rounding out here. It won't go on for forever. But I do want you to know that the incidence of severe weather, as you all, I'm sure, are very much aware, are increasing across the country. And if we look here at home, we know that in Detroit, they were seeing several repeated floods over the summer. In Houghton around Father's Day, they had rain so bad that it literally buckled the street. That was the 3rd once-in-a-thousand rain event in less than 10 years in the south shores of Lake Superior. And in Midland in spring, right when the pandemic was first starting, people were unvaccinated, the dams broke because of extreme rain events. Now the dams were kind of failing already, but that pushed them all over, this concept of threat multiplying. And then you take the pandemic and you force all these people out of their homes while they're unvaccinated. My heart broke for those people. In addition, about that same spring when we were seeing so much rain, there was flooding in the basement of Munson and the first floor. They handled it well, but it is where we store things like masks and other PPE and other things that are important. And of course, this has been seen across the country in things like in New Orleans with hurricanes. And it brings home the fact why we as health professionals really need to think about how we can be resilient, how we can be safe havens in the storm. So that is another whole big, long discussion that we can have if people are interested. This last event does bring home to me, though, why I'm so glad each of you are here. This was written by, it was an op-ed put in the New York Times, and it was written by the emergency room director. He oversaw 21 hospitals during the Kincaid fires. And he said, I must have missed the wildfire evacuation course in medical school. That just sends chills down my miss a wildfire evacuation course in medical school. Learning how to move critically ill patients while the flames licked the ground just feet away was not part of his training program. So I just want to bring home that point that extreme weather events and hospital systems and learning how to be resilient in the face of that is some of the issues that each of you are probably going to face going forward. And now here's our last case This is a 70-year-old woman with a history of lung cancer who requires 2 liters of oxygen. She's been doing fairly well, hasn't had to come into the hospital for over a year. Unfortunately, on this evening, there was an extreme storm that resulted in a large power outage over much of the area. Her family does not have a backup generator or a battery because they're quite expensive. They did have a cylinder of portable oxygen, but unfortunately it ran out in the middle of the night. So while she hoped to make it into the morning, she couldn't, and she presented in respiratory distress into the emergency room. So we need to think about our patients that require medical devices powered by electricity and the fact that they're very vulnerable to these extreme weather events. Climate change is truly a threat multiplier. This will be the last health impact, and then we'll transition to what we can do about it. But I did want to just emphasize that in our area in Michigan, if you haven't kind of got this impression already, what we see over and over again are extreme precipitation events. And one of the big problems is that our sewer infrastructure is not set up to handle these. If we have what's called a combined sewer overflow system, when it's sunny, there's no problem. You basically have the sewage going down and it never gets out into our rivers and lakes. But when it rains very heavily, the storm drain joins that of the sewer drain and it overflows this dam and can go into our rivers and waters. In 2016, 12 Michigan counties discharged essentially what was the equivalent to 16,000 Olympic swimming pools of untreated or partially treated stormwater. That's according to the NRDC. And so when this overflow water or other just flooded waters that is exposed to contaminants from animals or fertilizers or industrial pollution bleeds out, there's an increased risk of infectious disease. Between 2010 and 2014, combined sewer overflow increased the odds of a childhood ER visit for GI disease by 16%. So it floods and people get sick. That's the bottom line. Here in Michigan, we think about all of the fresh, beautiful water that surrounds us, 18% of the world's fresh water supply. And you would certainly think that our drinking water would be pure, but we know from Flint and elsewhere that that's not the case. And if we think about Lake Erie, back in 2014, they had an algae bloom that made their water look like this. They couldn't drink it, they couldn't cook in it, they couldn't shower in it. Now, toxic algae blooms have always occurred, but they're more frequent and intense now. The climate portion of that is the stronger storms and the warmer lakes, but then we use a lot of fertilizers that run off into the waters and provide a situation where algae can just flourish. So what should we be doing as health professionals? Well, fortunately, the medical community is finally starting to wake up, and you guys are part of that process. So I applaud each one of you who are here today. In 2017, a group of medical societies, including the American Medical Association, joined together to call for urgent action on climate change. It also includes internists and family practitioners and the pediatricians and the OB-GYNs and on and on. So we have a great contingency of medical professionals who are now recognizing that climate change is a concern. MiCCA, the organization that I started not too long ago, along with some my colleagues, Steve Ashmead, who's on here, is an active participant. Julie Quinn also started it. Payge has been involved. It is a state affiliate to that larger organization of medical societies I just talked about, the consortium. And what our goal is, and each of you are welcome to join, we're a coalition of health professionals, not just doctors, but also nurses and nurse practitioners and PAs that are focused on educating, empowering, and engaging the general public and policymakers. There are more and more peer-reviewed articles present in things like the New England Journal and the Lancet, and over 200 editors from over 200 medical journals came out earlier this year, right before the COP, to just bring home the point we have to get it right. If we don't get our emissions down below 1.5 degrees C, these editors from all over the world, famous journals, including the New England Journal, agreed that it will be catastrophic for our health. Lancet calls it the biggest public health crisis affecting us today. That's an interesting statement given the pandemic. But it's also the biggest health opportunity. And I'm sure you guys know why. Much of what we do to address climate change is also good for our health, whether it's active transportation or eating less meat or driving electric vehicles or not idling our car. Each of these things are good for our health and good for the environment. But in order to truly reduce emissions at the rate that we need collective action. So just like with the pandemic, it's great for us to get vaccinated and wear our masks, but we need it to be done collectively if we're really going to nip it in the bud. So we need policies in place that make the easy choice the healthy choice and the environmentally friendly choice. And that's why I think more and more as health professionals, we need to see our role as educating and advocating. We are trusted messengers, and we have to emphasize that just what I said, that it's not just a crisis, but it's also an opportunity. We can use our firsthand accounts like I did right here from our clinical practice, because those stories are more easily remembered than just data. But we can back them up with evidence-based literature. And that makes our statements that much more credible. We want to do it without hyperbole. It's critical that we build trust and we stay in that nonpartisan space. We're worried about human health. And so organizations like CCL and MiCCA and Medical Society Consortium and the Medical Students for a Sustainable Future, which I haven't introduced yet, all can give you the skills to advocate. Somebody asked about anxiety, climate anxiety in the questions before we submitted them, and I really do believe that action is the antidote to despair. What are some policies we should consider advocating for? Well, certainly we want to think about regenerative ag. We know that if we start being more careful about how we do our agriculture and we protect soil health, we can actually sequester carbon, and it will decrease the runoff that comes from our crops, and our crops will be more nutritious. There is one bill in place on the federal level called the Growing Climate Solutions Act. It has passed in a bipartisan way through the Senate that actually pays farmers to use more regenerative practices. We need to electrify our transportation system, but it won't be too effective if we don't also change our energy mix. So we do know that electric engines are more energy efficient than an internal combustion engine, and it pollutes the air much less, but we need to power those electric engines with solar and wind and non-carbon forms of energy rather than with coal. We need to improve energy efficiency and improve our grid so that we can deal with intermittency issues. But first and foremost, I think we need to catalyze this transition to the low carbon economy. And what not just what I think, it's what experts think is the most efficient way to catalyze it is a price or fee on emissions. Basically, you would start with a low fee, and it's on fossil fuel producers, not on individuals. And it would increase year by year by year until we transition away from non-carbon forms of energy. So it catalyzes that transition. It amplifies all the other work that we're doing. And if you want to protect those who are struggling financially to put gas in their car, you take the revenues that are generated from the fossil fuel polluters and you give it back to everyday folk in the form of a dividend. Many models have projected that if you do that, the vast majority of low and middle income families will come out ahead. So it acts like a booster shot, if you will, amplifying the effectiveness of complementary policies and spurring innovation like that smart grid and electric energy storage. And it takes a huge hunk out of emissions and cleans up the air, which is also good for our health. And this is the focus of Citizens Climate Lobby. So we're going to hear from Mary Ann about how you can get involved with Citizens Climate Lobby and what you can do locally. I certainly can help you with that as well. I did want to bring home that this is supported from the National Academy of Medicine. They recently wrote a letter to the Senate in support of a price on carbon during budget reconciliation, and that's a real possibility. The Senate is considering it right now, and you could right now call your senators. Emily will put the link in the chat and ask them to put a price on carbon during budget reconciliation. According to Bloomberg News, Senator Whitehouse said that 49 out of 50 of the senators are there ready to support it. So we're hopeful we can get that 50th. The Lancet also calls it the single best way to inoculate human health against the impacts of climate change. So we can do this. It's critical that this becomes standard part of our medical education. And so I'm glad that you're here. And what you can do is, and Emily will drop these in the link, is join Medical Students for a Sustainable Future, become a physician advocate for the consortium, join MiCCA if you would like, and join Citizens Climate Lobby and the Health Action Team and get involved. So what I'd like to do now is turn it over to Payge Barnard, who is a second-year medical student from the University of Michigan, and she has done some excellent work to educate and advocate in terms of climate and health. Payge, would you like to take it from here?
I would, thank you, and thank you guys for having me today. I'm very excited to be here. As Lisa said, I'm in my second year here at Michigan, so I'm on my rotations currently in family medicine right now. I was at UW-Madison for my undergrad, and I graduated back in 2018. I first really became aware of some of these environmental issues just by happening to take an environmental conservation course that really got me interested in this idea and aware of this problem that we have. Followed that up with another course on air pollution and human health, and decided that I wanted to be focused on this when I went into my medical training, if I made it that far. So then in my gap year, I got a certificate in health advocacy. That was at the law school for UW as well. And my capstone there was actually focused on an environmental justice project concerning a plant that was known to emit PCBs in Madison, Wisconsin. They were talking about putting up some affordable housing in the area. So I was kind of interested in that project, talking with city council and the decisions that were being made based around that problem, which also carried me forward into medical school, thinking about this issue. You can go to the next slide, Lisa. Okay, so I won't belabor this page too much, just in terms of why to care about climate change in general, because I think Lisa just gave a really great explanation of all the problems that we're seeing associated with patients and how that's going to get much worse. In my opinion, I think we should all care as medical students, because this is the future, and the future for our patients especially. We're seeing some of these changes now, and it's only going to get worse if we don't really clamp down on this problem. So I'm glad that you guys are all here and you're all interested in learning more about this topic as well. You can go ahead to the next slide. So in terms of things that I've been able to get involved with in medical school, because this was important to me, firstly, I want to plug our White Coats for Planetary Health. It's our student organization. It's a great org. If you don't already have an organization at your school, think about starting one surrounding climate change and awareness for medical students. I've been a general member for the past year or so. Some of the things I've gotten to do with the club is help plan our climate elective. That's going to be a new elective for our third and fourth year students to take, very focused on just being engaged with climate change and these problems. I particularly am focused on the environmental justice part of the course, but it's very broad in terms of sustainability and things of that nature. So we're hoping to offer that for the first round this January for our students and hopefully moving forward. We've also been working on a planetary health report card. My focus specifically on curriculum, because admittedly, Michigan does need some work with their curriculum in terms of incorporating more climate change. So if that's something that interests you, thinking about how your school also teaches on climate change and your awareness as medical students, that planetary health report card is actually through the club that Lisa had previously recommended on that last slide, that Medical Students for a Sustainable Future. Highly recommend joining that. That's a national organization of different medical schools throughout the country. So if you're wanting to get involved in advocacy, that's a good avenue to go through, and maybe setting up a chapter at your school if there's not one already there. And then, like Lisa said, I joined MiCCA within the past year. I was just a general member to start, but I've gotten to do a lot of things through them. And they kind of set me up with Citizens Climate Lobby, or CCL for short, too. I helped start planning our faculty development program here at Michigan, trying to get that hopefully going in the future, maybe. I had my first chance at lobbying through CCL. For that budget reconciliation that Lisa brought up a second ago. That was a very exciting opportunity. So if that interests you, there's avenues for that. And then today is another great example of how I've been able to get involved with speaking out to other medical students. And I encourage you all to do the same if this is something that you're passionate about.
That was excellent, Paige. Thanks so much. And Paige will be here so that we can ask her questions. She can be part of our, answering thing if she's wants to. And now I want to introduce Renz, who's a CCL volunteer extraordinaire. She is a retired communications professor from Central Michigan University. She's now a very active member of Citizens Climate Lobby. She serves as a liaison to 2 members of Congress, and she's active locally and throughout the state. And so she's going to offer some ways that you can get involved right here. And I'll turn it over to you, Marianne.
Thanks, Lisa. I created a document that I have sent to Emily and Lisa, and if you leave your email address, that will be sent to you. So the examples that I'm going to draw from that are not all of it, but I have also in the document the links to the organizations that have been mentioned. Paige just mentioned lobbying with Senator Peters' office. And as you heard in the initial introduction, I'm the liaison, or the person who sets up meetings with members of Congress and plans them in 2 districts in Michigan. The one that Kalamazoo is in, the 6th congressional district, where Fred is the member of Congress. And I'm not sure why I'm getting feedback now. And then also in the 5th congressional district, where Dan Kildee is a member of Congress, and that district follows the I-75 corridor from Essexville down to Flint. So we just recently have had a meeting with each of those offices, and we'll be trying to have meetings again, certainly by the summertime, but maybe in March also. I would love to have some WMed students who are interested in climate change do a shorter presentation than what Lisa just did about your concerns about climate change in Michigan, and have 1 or more of you join a lobby team. It could be a team entirely of WMed students, or it could be a team that has other people but 1 med student. So lobbying is one possibility. We just finished the summer season of the farmers market, but 1 day a month during the summer from May till November, we table at the farmers market, and people stop by and learn about climate change. It would be wonderful to have some of you join that, or have a table by yourselves. Similarly, Kalamazoo has, for the last several years, had an Earth Day event in April in Bronson Park or at the farmers market somewhere in Kalamazoo. Borges Hospital had one for a couple of years, and it would be great to have WMed students talking to people who stop by about the concerns about climate change. One of the people on this call whose name is just listed as Dave is Dr. Dave Carew, who's in the a biology faculty member at Western. He's part of a group that teaches an environmental climate change course every spring. And they would be happy to have WMed students talking about the impact of climate change on human health. So Dave has just shown his face there. Kalamazoo also has a climate crisis coalition, and we have Fridays for the Future. Twice a month on Friday afternoons, we have a Zoom call, and the topic one time could be the impact of climate change on human health, presented by Western med students. Now, these are all things that we can help with, I can help with, so I'm listed as a contact person for most of those, but those are simple things that you could do easily. There are other more complicated things that you could get involved with, such as making sure that climate change is integrated into courses in your curriculum. It's possible to have a separate course on it, but I think you've seen from Lisa's presentation that climate change impacts every specialty. And so to have it as a regular component in a curriculum where you don't really have a lot of opportunity for extra courses is probably the more efficient and logical way to go. And students could be involved in having that happen. There are other opportunities for those of you who are concerned about justice issues. The underserved communities in Kalamazoo's voices are not often heard about their concerns about environmental issues. And so it would be possible for you to collect those voices in interviews with people, developing some interview questions, doing the interviews. And then I can see two different outcomes from that. One possibility would be to work with a medium, radio or television station, and get those voices publicized throughout the community. Another possibility would be to use that as a basis for an article in a medical journal. And I think those are both possibilities. There are also other opportunities for you to do, I call it on the document a study abroad, but the abroad could be in Detroit, on a reservation for Native Americans, in another country. Those are opportunities. There are other kinds of opportunities for you to discover what some climate-related issues are and think about solutions and advocate in the local community. So one of the county commissioners in Kalamazoo is a doctor, and she has agreed to be a contact person if you were to present to the Kalamazoo County Commission some proposals for solutions to these health-related, climate-related issues. I'm not sure if that's enough, but probably it'll get your brain going. So those are some opportunities. I'd love to have you involved with the work that we're doing.
That's wonderful, Marianne. I love your creativity and real clear ideas. So what we were thinking now, thank you guys for hanging in through all of that. It's a lot, but we have plenty of time now to just answer some questions. And if people are shy, there were questions that you actually put in when you registered. Some people put some questions, so we can do that as well. I did want to see, Emily, do you have a copy of that document that Marianne had, and could you put that in the chat?
I will check my inbox right now for that.
Okay. And if not, I might have it. So should we open it up and see how we do? I'm going to stop sharing right now, but I do have some of the questions that you guys had asked that we can go back to I have them in like little slides, so we can do those if people are shy. But if you're online, just unmute and go ahead and ask questions. And if you're there, I think Mo's going to tell you how to do it. I'm not sure.
Yeah. So if you guys
Can't hear you well.
If you guys have questions, you can come up to me and like ask into the screen, or like I can do it on this laptop, so let me know. Or you can type in, whichever is easiest.
So Mo, I can't hear you too well, but I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen to do some of the questions that people asked, unless there are some people coming up to ask some or somebody on the line.
I think you can go ahead, Lisa.
Okay, don't hesitate to ask questions because it would be really fun to have, you know, just kind of an engaged discussion. But I will look at some of the questions that you guys posed when you registered. At least I think I will, if I can get my, there we go. So I think this has already been covered, but one of the questions was, you know, what can we do as medical students? And I think Mary Ann covered this really nicely. You know, it impacts every aspect of disease. We could do a dedicated elective like Payge is doing for 3rd and 4th year medical students at University of Michigan. That would be something that you guys could come together and try to get done. Or you could encourage or ask your administration to commit to putting 1 to 2 slides in most lectures that connect the dots between climate change and whatever they're teaching. They might learn something in the process. They could commit, if you really wanted to advocate, try to petition the boards to include it as part of your board exams. Boy, that would be a way to really incite your medical school to get going on it. Although you're very lucky because you have Dr. Dixon and you have Dr. Longjohn here who are being so supportive of your efforts. And it could be a combination of those 3. Anybody want to talk about ideas related to that and thoughts that they might have? There's something in the chat there.
Yeah, Lisa, I was going to say, looks like Faith had a response in the chat.
Okay, and I watched a documentary about the meat industry and the impact on environment. There were points about environmental impact significantly affects poor and colored communities more. How attainable or sustainable do you think encouraging people to pursue plant-based diet is, especially when it seems more expensive or time-consuming? I'm asking if any of you had success implementing this in your own life or encouraging others, including patients, to eat plant-based or more plant-based diets. So I think that's an awesome question. And I can tell you personally, that's the thing that I struggle with most, but you can probably tell from looking at me, diet is something that I struggle with any way, shape, form, or fashion. But I think it's one that's critically important. The amount of CO2 that goes into providing the food for cattle, and then the cattle generate themselves is really a lot. But I wish we did have anybody here who, Dave, do you have any expertise in that? Mary Ann, Payge, I bet do you have any ideas about it?
Yeah, I'm totally blanking on this physician's name, but we had a great lecture through a group on lifestyle medicine here for that organization that talked about meat primarily and its effects on human health and in respect to climate change. I can do some digging and maybe pass that information along, but just in current family medicine practice right now, just talking with patients about recommendations for like vegetable servings, and people seem pretty open to it and talking about maybe adding in more of that, taking out a little bit less of the meat. Even just starting small, patients are really receptive to that, and then building on that as you go.
Excellent. Mary Ann?
In Kalamazoo, there's an opportunity to use the Kalamazoo Valley Community College Food Innovation Center, where they are very well informed about the impacts of climate change on food and can provide some good suggestions for plant-based diets.
Excellent. And we did have for CCL, we had for our last health action team, we had a researcher who was part and founder of the One Health initiative that looks at the whole aspect of ag and health, and really gave a brilliant lecture. So I can see if I can provide links to that. to include in our follow-up information in case people want to pursue that further. Other questions about ag or other questions in general before I go on to another one that you guys brought up?
Well,
Dave.
Oh, sorry.
Dave has,
Dave and then Emily.
Yeah. I mean, clearly a vegan diet is most climate friendly, and then vegetarian, and then omnivore. When I talk about it in public talks or in classes, I encourage students to consider replacing beef with chicken in their diet if they're not willing to be vegetarian, because that'll cut down their meat-based carbon footprint by almost 3/4.
Wow.
So, yeah, I think there are other, I mean, it doesn't do anything for other parts of the diet, but the meat-based part, yeah, absolutely. And I tell them to think of the Chick-fil-A commercials where the misspelling notwithstanding, they say eat more chicken. I tell them that's a climate change commercial. They should follow that advice. So anyway, there are ways to reach people who are not willing to give up meat entirely.
Good, good. Emily, did you have a question?
I was going to comment. So I was actually pescatarian for quite a few years, and I'm from a family that is primarily meat eaters. And a way I got them to transition over that I found was easy was meatless Mondays. It sounds simple, but it's a really great way to introduce different types of proteins that maybe meat eaters wouldn't usually consider.
Excellent, excellent.
Yep.
Oh, other questions and comments, or should I move on? I can't really see the people who are there in person. I will move on if I can get my PowerPoint to do that. Somehow when we change it, like locks up. So let's try it this way. And so another question that kept coming up in the email was, what about environmental justice? And I think I touched on it to some extent, but I did want to just tell you MiCCA's philosophy on this, and that is environmental injustice is manifest in the health impacts of air pollution, water pollution, food scarcity, and the climate crisis. You guys all know that. And what we tried to do for MiCCA is to just be extremely humble, because we need to learn from those whose lived experience has been disproportionately disadvantaged by extraction and burning from fossil fuels, and learn and be inspired by their strength and their resilience and their hopeful spirit. And I did want to say that next Friday on December 10th, we have the good fortune of having a 2-hour advocacy training that's being put on by Wayne State's Cures. It includes Nick Schreck, who's at Detroit Mercy Law Center, as well as Sandra Handy Turner, who is an advocate in Detroit and works for the Michigan Environmental Council. And the registration for the event I have in the PowerPoint that we'll send out to you afterwards. And we would love for you guys to be there if that interests you. Any thoughts or comments about environmental justice that people have or been thinking about, or is there any way that we can help you know more about the advocacy program or other things, other comments that people have on that issue?
A great local group is Detroiters Working for Environmental Justice. You can look into some of the work that they've been doing just for ideas of what environmental advocacy looks like from that perspective. We're planning to have them talk for a part of our climate elective. So any initiatives too you can get for professionals in that sphere speaking to students or things of that nature is really useful.
That's terrific. Other thoughts? I am putting the registration link for Friday's conference in the chat. So you can go right there and register if people are interested. And if people don't have more questions, we'll go to some of the ones that came in from from you guys earlier. We had a question, we had actually 2 or 3 questions on this, which was, what about healthcare's carbon footprint? What can be done about it? Is there a way we can change that? And what about single-use plastics in hospitals and medical waste? And I have to tell you that this is not my area of anywhere near my area of expertise, but I do think it's a critically important area. Healthcare Without Harm is the organization that is leading on this by far. And again, this will be in the list in the PowerPoint when we send it out to you. I encourage anybody who's interested in this aspect to contact Healthcare Without Harm. I put my email in the chat as well. I'm happy to do an email introduction to their physician liaison coordinator as well. There was a question about carbon footprint in general for healthcare. And if global healthcare were a country, it would be the 5th leading emitter of greenhouse gases, the 5th largest emitter. And if the US healthcare system were a country, it would be the 13th leading emitter. So that's where Healthcare Without Harm comes up with this first do no harm. One of the big problems in healthcare is anesthetics, fluoride-based anesthetics and nitrous oxides. They're incredibly potent and incredibly potent greenhouse gases. And there's a large amount of peer-reviewed literature talking about how the choices in anesthetics can greatly reduce carbon footprint. And a lot of times those are released just out into the atmosphere. So different ways to capture the anesthetics. And then again, in the PowerPoint I'll send you, there's a New England Journal of Medicine report that just came out maybe a month ago that summarizes the importance of decarbonizing healthcare, which I have a link to. And, you know, I did want to emphasize this just to show you what you guys can do. Emily Johnson was a 4th-year medical student at University of Michigan. She got involved in MiCCA. She was the one that first started the elective for 3rd and 4th-year students. She organized that. She actually organized a whole webinar that we did last year on this issue of decarbonizing health. And so I have a link to her webinar where she brought people from Healthcare Without Harm, leaders on this subject to do an educational session. And that is another whole topic that could take the whole hour, but I encourage you to look at the webinar if you guys are interested. So other questions about that? And that was done by 4th-year med student. Other questions about that, you guys? Are people still here? Do we want to keep going? And see what the next.
I don't think that there's any questions on this end.
Okay. Climate anxiety, somebody asked about that. And I know there's at least one person in here who is thinking about a psychiatry residency. So I would like to just touch on that briefly. And I glossed right over this, but it is one that affects many, many people as individuals, myself included, and will likely impact many of our patients. And again, I go back to that whole thing for personally, that action is the antidote to despair. Actively pursuing something can really help with anxiety surrounding climate change. And then I do have, and there will be in this PowerPoint, a link to the Climate Psychiatry Alliance. It is doing phenomenal work to educate people on the mental health impacts of climate change. And it would be, if you're thinking about doing psychiatry and you care about this issue, I would definitely become a member. A couple key points about mental health impacts that are pretty self-evident, I would think. Extreme weather events, obviously, can increase anxiety, and it can lead to climate migration and to violence. When people are forced out of their home for whatever reasons, rising sea levels, an extreme weather event, that is incredibly unsettling and leads to mental health impacts. And things like extreme heat tend to make people more anxious and more violent, and actually make some antipsychotic and anti-anxiety meds less effective. So there's a lot of interplay between mental health and climate change. I am just touching on it very superficially, but it is another whole area we could easily do a whole hour worth of discussion. Any ideas or discussions about that people would like to add to? I think that might be our last question. Oh no, we have one more question. I'll go on if people don't have thoughts about that. This is the one, this is the one I know the absolute least about. So here we go. Somebody wrote, I'd love to know the differences that exist in this topic in developing versus developed countries. And me too, okay? I'm not super knowledgeable about this subject, but I would like to be. And here's what I do know, and I'd love to get input from other people who know more. The US has been the leading emitter historically of greenhouse gases, while developing countries have suffered the brunt of fossil fuel impacts. So there's huge injustices here. And what I also know is that a price on carbon with a border adjustment is critical to ensure that we get a rapid global transition to low carbon economy. And I can explain that in more detail if you want, but that really is when a country like the US puts a price on carbon with a border adjustment, it will almost force other countries who want to do business with us to put on an equivalent price. And Europe and Canada are already working towards that. They're going to start working on that in 2023. So they're kind of leading the charge and forcing us to step up. And I hope we do step up. And then I'm putting some links again in here. There's something called the Healthy Climate Prescription that was for COP26 that will tell you a lot about what's going on in the global arena. So I'll just now stop sharing and see if anybody has anything that they'd like to add, and either on that topic or just asking people, you know, what are they surprised about from this presentation? What interests them? And what do they want to learn more about? Don't everybody speak at once.
I mean, okay, so I'll ask a question. So how do we hold developing countries to the same standards as developed countries, considering we tend to designate all of our carbon heavy footprint to those like global south countries? Like all of our stuff is made in China or made in like Taiwan or made in the Philippines. And so we just send all of our carbon heavy footprint to them. And then we like feel better about it because we're like, oh, like we're doing great. And I'm like, yes, but we import a lot of stuff from places that are not doing great.
I think that's where the border adjustment is so key. So if we actually during budget reconciliation put a price on carbon, essentially what that does, it starts low, goes high until it forces the transition to a low carbon economy. What the border adjustment does is if China wants to do business with the US, they have to have an equivalent price on carbon in their country, or else they'll be hit with a border adjustment. And there's an incentive to do that because they would probably rather keep the money in their country than they would pay it at the US border. So I think that's the incentive. That's kind of the domino effect of a carbon price. And I think that that's really important. Now, does that deal with the injustices of places like India and, you know, elsewhere where they're trying to live with and should have the opportunity to live with the quality of life that we've had the privilege of having? I don't think it begins to answer that question, and it would take somebody smarter than me to figure that out. Marianne, what's your thought?
The other thing I would add, Mo, is that there are now renewable energy opportunities that are easily implemented and are being implemented in developing countries. I spent 3 weeks in Tanzania one year, and we often had no power. The electricity went down, but solar energy can provide that easily. And so as we help, as developed nations help developing nations, or the developing nations themselves are able to jump past the fossil fuel use we used when we began to use electricity, they can avoid some of the problems that we have.
Kind of a leapfrog phenomenon.
Yeah.
Anybody else? Dr. Dixon, Dr. Longjohn, anything you guys want to add?
I'll just say for the students, and I'll try and talk loud enough for Lisa here, but Mary Ann, Lisa had some good ideas for especially folks who are thinking about where you can volunteer over the next couple of years, depending on where you are in the curriculum. Dr. Dixon and myself are happy to work with you to figure out how to help you get some guidance on those projects. If you connect with Mary Ann, you're trying to do some of this work, you can make sure that connected to if you're a first year, active citizenship. If it's not first year, you're looking for distinction or et cetera. We can talk to that all of that.
And I also wonder, and like, correct me if I'm like not thinking this through, but like, is this something we can add to the systemic inequity elective? Just like, yeah. So we do have an elective that Dr. Dixon hosts that is on systemic inequity. And I think this is a great topic to add to that because it is an equity issue. Like it's a justice issue, so.
No doubt. That's great. Dave, did you have another comment or?
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'm a minute or two out of sequence here, but I think it would be a mistake to feel like we are doing better than developing countries. And the major metric that I would think about is per capita carbon footprint. And ours is so much higher than any developing country, including China and India. So not only has the US historically accounted for more emissions, greenhouse gas emissions than any other country, but today each one of us, each citizen of the US is accounting for more greenhouse gas emissions than any citizen of any developing country. So I think Marianne's right. The hope is that they can achieve a standard of living similar to ours without increasing their per capita carbon footprint to anything like ours. And that can only happen if they skip the step of generating electricity by coal.
That's a great point, Jake, so much. And you're right. Hopefully they'll just leapfrog right over that. And for the reasons that Marianne brought up with solar, that, that might be a more achievable process.
Yeah, Dave, that's a great point. That was along my lines of thinking with it too. Even changing our own emissions and the way that we affect climate change. A lot of those underdeveloped countries, unfortunately, sit along like the equator line. They're affected by the flooding, and we contribute to that. So just changing our ways, impacting natural disasters that happen in some of these countries is one place to start as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and globally, even just using today's technologies, either wind or solar alone, and any one of the three solar technologies could produce at least 40 times all the energy that humans use in all forms, not just electricity. So there's absolutely no reason not to help them transition to self-sustainable energy production, clean energy production as quickly as possible. It's my opinion anyway.
That's a very hopeful opinion, though. I love that. That's great. So any more brainstormings on that topic or on just what you guys want to do to get things going in WMed on this issue?
I just want to say that you gave a lot of options, a lot of suggestions. Can you hear me? You have to look.
Having trouble hearing you.
Might have to mic in.
Can you hear me now, Lisa?
Yeah.
Hi, this is Cheryl. I just wanted to say that thank you to all of you all that presented. And we gave quite a few suggestions. We gave a lot of suggestions of things that we can begin to look at here. Our students can look at different areas that they may want to get involved in, and also even to create. I like the interest group. There's the national interest group page. Thank you for all the work you're doing as a medical student. It's amazing. I just think that, you know, we are actually new, and we have an opportunity to really, the students also have an opportunity to really create some new stuff here that will be exciting and really, really make a difference. So thank you again. And I just think all that information, the students can look it over and really kind of like decide. We have a public health distinction program. So any of those things that you suggested could also be something that's translated into the distinction for students as well. So thank you again.
That's so awesome. You guys are, it's wonderful. I'm so glad that you're helping them along and supporting them in this way. Dr. Dixon. Marianne. You're muted.
I have a question for those of you who are in the room there. How was Zarunas?
You guys can tell me. Thanks, God. So I think it was a positive outcome.
Good.
That's terrific.
Recommendation.
Yeah, thanks, Marianne.
They were like, you should get Zarunas. And I was like, all right, say less.
Well, you guys, if there are no more questions, we can close out. Do make sure that we have your emails, or people can feel free to email me. And Emily is willing to send out, you know, the PowerPoint, the PDF of this PowerPoint, so that you guys can check out all the different links that we gave, you know, whatever interests you. And a big thank you to Paige and Marianne and Dave. I really appreciate your input. Thanks for having us here. Mo, you've done a ton coordinating things. Drs. Dixon and Long John, thank you so much.
So I am going to say, if you guys want more information, I know people put their emails in the chat. If you guys could fill out the form, that would be really helpful, just so that we can like keep track, and then it'd be just easy to like forward that to Lisa, and then she can get all the information out to you guys. So I will post it again, but yeah, if you can just fill out the form, if you want more information, that'd be great.
That's great. Terrific, guys. I am really excited to see what you guys come up with. And please know that, you know, we're happy to try in whatever ways we can to back you up. If we can, we'd like to be able to do that. Paige, I bet you're on clinics. If you need to go, please feel free. But thank you so much for making it. You really added a lot to the discussion.
Absolutely. Thank you. And thanks for everybody for organizing this. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you
See ya.
so much for taking the time to come out.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. All right. If everyone has any other questions, now is the time. Or forever hold your peace.
Or email me.
Yeah. So so Lisa put her email in the chat. If you have any other questions, feel free to email her.
Thank you, Mo.
Of course. All right, so I think we're gonna log off. Thank you again so much, Lisa, for taking the time.
Thank you.
For everyone, Marianne, Emily, everyone, Dave, for taking the time out of your day. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Mo. Bye-bye.
Take care.